Hello summoners, and welcome to another ProGuides video. I'm Tia, and today we'll be talking about 5 sleeper OP picks and builds that you should be abusing for some free LP. You definitely know the popular OP picks and builds since they're all over social media, including our own YouTube channel. But in this video, we'll be looking at some of the lesser known builds today. We'll be starting things off with Tahm Kench. When he first came out, Tahm was absolutely overloaded. Even as a support, he could easily solo kill carries, and I don't mean that in an exaggerated type of way. Tahm literally had the damage at all stages of the game to solo kill most champs he could get his tongue on. Get it? His W alone would do half of their HP, and when they weren't being gobbled up, they were stuck in a chain of slows and stuns from his Q. And that's just using him offensively. He was even more OP as a defensive support back then too. So naturally, the champ saw nerf after nerf, and even mini reworks that sought to change how strong he was. At first, the nerfs aimed to change how overbearing he was on offense, but his presence, especially in pro play, never changed. His W was just too strong. It got to the point that Riot was just so desperate to nerf him that they basically made his entire kit useless as a support, aside from his ability to eat an ally and save them from danger. While every change they've done to Tahm has made him a horrible support, he's still a super oppressive top laner who can beat down many of the harder matchups that people, especially those in the lower elos, struggle with. Basically, Tahm Kench can bully every single champ in lane, but he's not just a go-to pick to win every game. In a 5v5 setting, he basically becomes completely useless. So against tanks like Malphite and Ornn, even if you dumpster them in lane, they'll eventually be more useful once they group up and 5v5. Tahm Kench is best as a pick against carry top laners that rely on split pushing to win. The idea is to bully them in laning phase and outduel them in side lanes as a split pusher. Since they're just super behind carries, they won't be useful if they group 5v5 either, so you're essentially turning the game into a 4v5. Now, one question you may have is, if Tahm works, why not just pick another tank so you can also be useful in team fights? It's true that most tanks can build to counter some matchups top lane, but they're usually pretty weak in the early game. I've personally seen many tanks take overly ambitious trades, not realizing they aren't exactly tanky yet. The result is they die and then they fall behind so hard that they never actually get tanky enough to be a good frontliner in fights. You can definitely play more passive and scale on those champs, but if you want a tank that can surprise your opponent by going for an all-in at level 1, a la Darius, Tahm may fit your playstyle a little better. He's especially useful as a counterpick if you don't know how to deal with other barbaric champs that run at you and try to cheese early kills, like Trin or Darius. There isn't much to give as far as gameplay tips go. You'll look to trade as often as you can, and 5v5 team fighting should be kept to a minimum. It's fine to use your ult to fight with a numbers advantage, or to set up an ally with strong engage for a flank, but other than that, try to maintain split pressure against your lane opponent all game. Now for the build. For your items, you'll start off with Doran Shield, build into Bommies, Bramble Vest, and Steel Caps, then upgrade Bommies to Frostfire Gauntlet and Bramble to Thornmail. Frostfire and your Q give you a lot of sticking power, but you lack the ability to actually get onto champs consistently, so you'll go for Dead Man's Plate next. After that, grab Spirit Visage and then end things with Warmog's Armor. If you're dealing with a crit-heavy champ like Trin, Yone, or Yasuo, you can opt for a Randuin's instead. For your runes, you'll run Grasp of the Undying, Demolish, Second Wind or Bone Plating, Overgrowth or Unflinching, Alacrity, and Last Stand, with the stat runes being Attack Speed, Armor, and Health. After being completely gutted as a support, a very small minority of Kench players have continued to make him work as a top laner. And that brings us to today's question of the day. What champ is bad in their main role, but good in an off-meta role? For me, the first other champ that comes to mind is Brand. He's able to be more lane-dominant bot than he is mid, and in team fights, he basically has the same role. Blow things up and do a lot of AoE damage. My kind of playstyle. Also, playing him support leaves the mid lane slot open for a champ that brings more to the table as a solo laner. But that's just me, and we want to hear from you all, so let us know your answer down in the comments below. I really do read them. Next up, we have an alternative build for Elise. The standard Elise build is already OP, so much so that she's an S+ tier pick in the jungle. Against squishy targets, Elise easily one-shots them with a single combo, but against tankier targets, it may take more than one rotation of spells to bring them down. Against actual tanks, this may not be much of an issue. They don't exactly do enough damage to kill Elise, with the healing from her passive alone basically allowing you to restore back the HP that the tanks take away. But against bruisers and juggernauts, you can run into a problem. Sure, early game you'll be able to 100 to 0 them, But as the game goes on, those champs start to build up more HP and resistances, and most of them either build a ton of healing via items, have it built into their kits, or a mix of both. If you fail to kill someone like Fiora, Lee Sin, Darius, Aatrox, or any other champ that falls into that bubble, odds are you won't be able to finish them off at all, as they heal back up the damage you dealt to them as they kill you instead. And so, I present to you all DPS Elise, a build that sacrifices just a bit of burst damage for much higher damage over time, resulting in much better extended trades against beefier targets. We'll talk about the full runes and items in just a second, but the main change-ups here are swapping out Electrocute for PTA and Lichbane for Gnasher's Tooth. Press the Attack's Exposed debuff gives a lot more effective damage over time against beefier opponents, while Gnasher's Tooth synergizes well with the on-hit damage Elise has in Spider form, as well as her W's attack speed steroid, giving you way more damage to fill between the gaps in your spell's cooldowns. This new build isn't suddenly going to make Elise an OP champ for team fighting, but with this, you should have a much better time scaling against otherwise problematic champs in the mid to late game. This means you have more options for targets to look for picks on, which is especially useful in games where the opposing team is using a 4-1 or 1-3-1 strat, where their squishy targets are permanently grouped with teammates that can potentially keep them safe from you. Now, for the build. For your items, you'll start with Ember Knife, then build into Sork Shoes and Night Harvester. While the goal with this build is more DPS later, this starting core gives you the strong burst to one-shot targets you're able to land your full combo on in the early stages. After that, you're going to pick up Gnasher's Tooth and an Oblivion Orb. Sit on the orb for now, focusing on building Void Staff, then Rabadons, and then upgrade the orb to Morellonomicon. You'll notice this build doesn't at all include Zhonya's, which many players opt for on Elise, but your goal is to do as much damage as possible to melt these tougher to kill targets, so that's what our build is set to do. For runes, you'll run Press the Attack, Triumph, Alacrity, Coup de Grace, Eyeball Collection, and Relentless Hunter, with the stat runes being Attack Speed, Adaptive Force, and Armor. Whether you're playing Elise with the standard build or this more slept on but still OP DPS build, the key to making her work is constant aggression. You need to clear a few camps, then gank early and often, applying non-stop pressure to your opponents in an attempt to close the game out as fast as you can. If you struggle to consistently snowball early, know how to snowball early but can't quite close out games, or struggle in any other facet of the game, we're here to help. At ProGuides.com, our top-tier coaches are available 24/7 and ready to help you solve any and all your problems, whether it's a basic fundamental one or something that requires a more tailored approach. So head on over and book your session now. With our help, you'll save time grinding away figuring things out, so you can spend more time actually climbing the ladder. Now, without further ado, let's get back to the video. Our third entry is another jungler, this time talking about a new mythic on Lee Sin. Since the new items hit, Lee has struggled to find much success. He's been constantly overshadowed by the other early game junglers, hard farming carries, and tanks. The new item system just didn't really click with him the same way it did with other champs. There were still a few Lee Sin aficionados that made him work, but you had to be very good to do so, and for me, that was just too much effort to do what 20 other champs could do, but with much easier execution. But that was then, and this is now. Pretty much every other champ in the role has been nerfed, and Lee Sin has slowly but surely risen up as a pretty solid pick. His Plat Plus win rate is just above 50%, but when you consider the high skill floor and ceiling on the champ, you have to realize how hard that win rate is tanked by auto-filled players and those learning the champ. Once you get over his pretty difficult mastery curve, you can carry pretty darn hard with the Blind Monk. His early game dueling and ganks are top tier, and he doesn't fall off as hard as other early picks, with strong dueling throughout the game and the ability to either peel or make huge plays by kicking a target into his team with his ult. But even a lot of the best Lee Sin players are missing out on the new tech. The current standard build for Lee is to either go Eclipse for more damage and better dueling, or Gore Drinker for better team fighting. Prowler's Claw was something many players tried for a while. It sounds good in theory, but in practice, it's just too clunky, and that's just not something you want on Lee, who relies on quickly dashing around to make flashy plays. And that's where Stridebreaker comes in. When your flash is down and you don't have a ward to hop to, the extra dash and slow gives you an extra way to get onto and behind your target. Not only is this smoother than Prowler's Claw for easier comboing, it also has a much lower cooldown, able to be used multiple times in extended fights. On top of that, it also trades out some damage for HP, and if you're going for insects over assassinating the target yourself, you probably would rather have that trade of stats anyways. Now for the build. For items, you'll start with Ember Knife, then go Stridebreaker and Lucidity Boots. If you're dealing with an AD heavy enemy team or one loaded with CC, feel free to opt for Steel Caps or Merc Treads. After that, go for Sterix Gauge, Black Cleaver, and Death's Dance. The last item slot can be used for GA, Spirit Visage, or Silvermere Dawn if you need to get out of CC to make your plays. For runes, you'll run Conqueror, Triumph, Alacrity or Tenacity, Coup de Grace, Sudden Impact, and Relentless Hunter, with the stat runes being Attack Speed, Adaptive Force, and Armor. Our next build is taking us back to the top lane with a bit of a change up for the build and playstyle you normally see on Shen. Shen deviates quite a bit from the identity of most other tanks. While Malphite, Maokai, Ornn, and pretty much anyone else in that class of champ usually prefer to get through lane phase and then serve as a massive wall in fights, Shen is usually found in a side lane the entire game. The pressure of constantly splitting gives your team more options on a macro level. If no one replies to the Shen split, well, free towers, yay! If they do come to match you, you can often duel whoever it is and still exert pressure. If they send multiple members, all the better. You can ult out and force with numbers on the other side of the map. The enemy team can never really force on your team either since they never actually have the numbers advantage since you can ult right into the fight. Basically, when you're ahead on Shen, the opposing team can't really take a winning fight. And now, we have a new Shen build that's still flying under the radar that you should totally start abusing before it gets nerfed. You're welcome. This build involves building more haste than the standard Shen build, as well as picking up some healing and shielding items. More haste means more Q spam, which means more passive procs, with the healing and shielding items making those passive shields pretty thick. And that's thick with 3 Cs. On top of that, once you're full build, your ults will be absolutely massive, guaranteeing that your target doesn't get bursted down before you can complete your channel and save the fight. While it does give up some of the damage that the Sunfire Titanic Hydra combo gives, the increased shields and more frequent procs for your passive give you dueling that is just as strong. It'll just be a slower, more drawn-out battle that your opponent has no hope of winning. Alright, enough talking about it. Here's the build. For items, you'll start out with Doran Shield and then build into Turbo Chem Tank, and then either Steel Caps or Merc Treads, depending on your lane matchup. Then build into Redemption and Mikhail's Crucible for those huge fatty shields. After that, you'll want Spirit Visage and either Warmogs or Thornmail, whichever suits your game more. Before we get to the runes, I want to talk about why you go Redemption and Mikhail's over Ardent and Staff. Redemption and Mikhail's have 20% healing and shield power each, while the other two have 10%. Having a total of 40% of shielding really adds up when you're constantly proccing his passive in duels. On top of that, you just don't really get much value out of Staff and Ardent's passives. They may be OP on enchanters that can repeatedly proc them for allies, but for Shen, it's much more value to have a bigger shield for your ult from the other 2 item stats. On top of that again, you'll get the bonus of having Redemptions and Mikhail's actives so you bring even more utility to team fights. Now for the runes. You'll run Grasp of the Undying, Shield Bash, Second Wind, or Bone Plating depending on the lane, Revitalize, Cheap Shot, and Ultimate Hunter, with the stat runes being Adaptive Force, Armor or MR, and HP. Finishing off our list, we'll be revisiting something we've already discussed in a previous video, the one-shot build for Varus mid. When we first got wind of this build, we figured it'd definitely get a bit of traction you'd at least see every now and then. But for one reason or another, it hasn't really caught on with many players, which is all the more reason that you should be abusing it. If a champ has the ability to completely one-shot an opponent or 2 or 3, but that champ is rarely ever seen, no one you play against is going to expect that obscene damage. And with Varus, those one-shots happen from basically off the screen, so it's incredibly hard for opponents to counter it. This build is technically viable on both bottom and mid lane Varus, but when you're playing casters aiming to one-shot targets, extra levels mean more damage, so mid is definitely the preferred way to go. Early game will be pretty slow-paced. Your goal is to farm up the wave, poking your opponent here and there when you can, but not so much that you go for spamming. Any kills you can pick up are nice, but you don't need to snowball or anything for this build to work, so make your priority to farm up safely. Once you're 6, the CC and damage from your combo makes you a more capable fighter, but you won't have the damage to go for solo kills on your own. Instead, you should be fighting with your jungler, either as they gank your lane or in skirmishes for scuttle crabs or dragon. You'll spend the first portion of the game playing this way, aiming to fight with your jungler, but once you finish 3 items, you'll come online as a one-shot machine. While other long-ranged artillery mages have to whittle down foes with spell after spell, you'll be completely obliterating them from the map anytime you can land your ult on them. If you're still not completely convinced, there's one more thing to say. Most one-shot champs are excellent at taking out squishy ADCs and control mages, but are completely useless when they have to deal with a tankier target. If a diver gets onto a burst mage, and that burst mage isn't insanely fed to the point that they are a full item or two ahead of that diver, odds are that they're dead. But with Varus, no targets can withstand his immense burst. His blight stacks do a huge percent of your target's max HP, so with your full combo, you can easily burst down targets with over 3000 HP when you're full build. So as long as you can work with your jungler to reach the mid game where this build truly comes online, you'll have almost no weakness, and you can use your low cooldown ult to make pick after pick after pick and carry your team to victory. Now for our final build. For items, you'll start Tear of the Goddess, upgrading that to Mana Mune as soon as you can for your first item. After that, grab Tier 1 boots, build into Luden's Tempest, then upgrade your boots to Sork Shoes. Next up, build into Horizon Focus. At this point, you have one-shot potential against all the tankiest of targets. To be able to bring down the beefy boys, build Void Staff, then Rabadons, but if no one on the enemy team is stacking magic resistance yet, you can go for Rabadons first. For runes, you'll go for Dark Harvest as your keystone. Electrocute is also viable, but requires you to get into E range to proc. The rest of your runes are Cheap Shot, Eyeball Collection, Ultimate Hunter, Absolute Focus, and Gathering Storm, with the stat runes being Ability Haste, Adaptive Force, and either Armor or Magic Resist. Again, I want to note that this build requires a bit of scaling, so if you have a game that ends really fast, don't take it as a good sample of how OP it really is. Give it a few tries, and once you actually reach those mid to late game points where you're absolutely one-shotting opponents, you'll find out it's worth the wait. And that wraps things up for our sleeper builds you're missing out on for patch 11.9. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to sub so you never miss out on our meta guides, so you're always in the loop on what the best picks are. Remember to let us know which champ you think is best in an unintended role down in the comments below. Like I mentioned before, I really do enjoy reading y'all's comments and appreciate y'all's answers. And one last thing, don't forget to check out our Discord in the description box below, where you can discuss League further or just hang out and talk about anime and be part of our community. I can't wait to see you guys back for the next video, but until then, I just want you guys to know that I appreciate y'all and I hope you have a great day. Oh, and thanks for all the follows on IG, guys. It's really been a fun time memeing with you all. Okay,